astronaut Gene Cernan described his visit to the moon as gazing back on the Earth from God's front porch.
What if the real reason we stopped going to the moon had nothing to do with rockets or money, but with something far more personal, far more painful, and never fully explained to the public?
I looked over my shoulder, and there's the Earth. There's reality. There's home. I wanted to press the freeze button. I wanted to stop time.
Welcome back. Today we explore one of the most fascinating questions in human history. Why did we reach the moon and then stop? This isn't a conspiracy video. We're diving into the real reasons. Budget battles, political choices, psychological tolls, and the haunting words of the astronauts who were actually there. Hit subscribe and stay with us because the full story is way more interesting than any conspiracy theory.
Liftoff. We have liftoff.
The last footstep nobody planned. For on December 14, 1972, Commander Gene Cernan stepped off the lunar surface, climbed into the Apollo 17 lunar module, and spoke these words: "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." He meant it. Everyone at NASA meant it. At the time of the Apollo 11 landing in July 1969, NASA had plans for 9 more missions to the moon, all the way through to Apollo 20 in December 1972. There were even grand ambitions for a permanent lunar base and a crewed mission to Mars by the mid-1980s. Nobody was planning to leave the moon and never come back, but that is exactly what happened. And Cernan, who died in January 2017 at age 82, spent the rest of his life openly disappointed about it. He said on multiple occasions, "I'm quite disappointed that I'm still the last man on the moon." He also said, "Here I am at the turn of the millennium and I'm still the last man to have walked on the moon." Somewhat disappointing. It says more about what we have not done than about what we have done. That line right there, sit with it. A man who walked on the moon, who risked his life doing it, who gave years of his life to the Apollo program, and his lasting feeling about the whole thing was disappointment. Not pride alone, but genuine, deep disappointment that nobody followed him back. That tells you everything about how the story of the moon ended.
Fido, go, kite, go. Roll, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. The Eagle has landed. We copy you down, Eagle. Step per man. 1 diathlete per man.
The race that ended the moment it was won. To understand why we stopped going to the moon, you first have to understand why we went in the first place. And the honest answer is, we went to win a geopolitical race, not because of pure love of exploration. The space race was a Cold War weapon. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in October 1957, sent the first human to space in April 1961 with Yuri Gagarin, and was consistently making the United States look technologically inferior. That terrified American leadership. President John F. Kennedy did not stand before Congress in May 1961 and call for a moon landing because he loved astronomy. He did it because the United States needed a spectacular, undeniable win over the Soviet Union on the world stage. As space historian Professor Anu Ojha put it plainly, the answer is we changed our priorities. From a combination of the Vietnam War, but also there was this geopolitical element of thinking, we've won the race. Just as we'd got good at doing science on the moon, we abandoned it. The moment Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the Sea of Tranquility on July 20, 1969, the core purpose of the Apollo program was complete. The race was won. America had beaten the Soviets. And almost immediately, the political will to keep spending enormous amounts of money on the moon began to collapse. The rocket was built, the flag was planted, the point was made. Why go back?
And still today, scientists are studying the Apollo findings to help plan for future deep space travel.
The money problem nobody wanted to talk about here is a number that puts the whole thing in perspective. At its peak in 1966, NASA's budget consumed 4.41% of the entire United States federal budget. By 1970, that had already dropped to 1.92%, and it kept falling. The Apollo program cost somewhere around $25 billion at the time, which in today's money amounts to well over $280 billion. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of money to spend on any single program. And after Apollo 11, the American public, the U.S. Congress, and the Nixon administration all started asking the same question: why are we still spending all this money? The Vietnam War was draining resources. American cities were struggling with poverty, civil unrest, and infrastructure problems. Inflation was rising, and the Apollo missions, extraordinary as they were scientifically, were not capturing public imagination the way Apollo 11 had. After the first moon landing, people started tuning out. The New York Times noted after Apollo 12 that a collective sense of anti-climax had set in. A moon landing was becoming ordinary. Congress cut NASA's budget in a series of steady, punishing reductions. Apollo program funding dropped by nearly 50% in a short period of time, falling below the $1 billion mark for the first time in 8 years. The message from Washington was clear. Space exploration was no longer a national emergency. It was a luxury.
Cernan was commander of the Apollo 17 mission in 1972. On December 14th of the very same year, he became the last of only a dozen men to walk the moon.
The 3 missions that died on paper. Here is something that still stings if you love space history. Apollo 18, Apollo 19, and Apollo 20 were real missions. They had real spacecraft being built. They had real astronauts being assigned to crews. They had real landing sites picked out, including scientifically extraordinary locations like the Copernicus crater, Schroeder's Valley, and the Hyginus Rill region. These missions would have spent 3 days on the lunar surface, used rovers for long-range exploration, and brought back samples from some of the most geologically rich spots on the moon. NASA canceled Apollo 20 in January 1970, just 6 months after the triumph of Apollo 11, to repurpose its Saturn V rocket for the Skylab space station. Then in September 1970, NASA officially canceled both Apollo 18 and Apollo 19 due to budget cuts and shifting priorities. 2 fully assembled Saturn V rockets that were meant to go to the moon ended up as museum exhibits. One sits today at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, another is at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You can walk up and touch a rocket that was supposed to go to the moon and never did. Astronaut Harrison Schmitt, a geologist who was expected to fly on one of those canceled missions, later reflected that NASA managers at the time had far less confidence in the Saturn V and Apollo systems than the astronauts who actually flew them. That fear that something catastrophic might happen also quietly influenced the decision to wind things down. The near disaster of Apollo 13 in April 1970, when an oxygen tank explosion crippled the spacecraft and nearly cost 3 astronauts their lives, made everyone inside NASA deeply aware that each mission was a roll of the dice. John Young, who flew on Apollo 10 and Apollo 16, believed directly that fear of losing astronauts was a major reason NASA chose to cancel the final 3 missions. Robert Gilruth, the legendary director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, reportedly said Apollo flights should stop now before we lose someone. They had already come terrifyingly close.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We could have lost O2 tank 2. We got to get a pressure readout on that thing.
O2 quantity number 2 is 0.
Apollo 13 and the shadow it cast forever. It is impossible to talk about why we stopped going to the moon without spending real time on Apollo 13. On April 13, 1970, about 56 hours into the mission, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. Commander Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were suddenly stranded in deep space, 200,000 miles from Earth with a crippled spacecraft. The mission, which was supposed to be the 3rd lunar landing, was aborted instantly. The 3 astronauts squeezed into the tiny lunar module, which was designed for 2 people on a short trip to the moon's surface, and used it as a lifeboat. Using the moon's gravity as a slingshot, they looped around the lunar surface and began the long journey home, surviving on minimal power, freezing temperatures, and dwindling water. Against every conceivable odd, they made it back. NASA called it a successful failure. But within NASA, Apollo 13 was a permanent, sobering reminder of just how thin the margin between a triumphant mission and a catastrophe really was. Every mission after Apollo 13 carried that shadow, and every mission that was canceled after it carried a quiet acknowledgement that they were also canceling the risk that someone might not come home. The families of astronauts, the NASA leadership, even the White House knew that a fatal accident on the moon would not just end the lives of 3 human beings, it would likely end the entire program and possibly set back American space exploration by decades. So the risk was not just personal, it was institutional, it was political. And in a strange way, Apollo 13's survival may have accelerated the end of the Apollo program rather than strengthened it.
I was 36 years old when I went to the moon. I landed on the moon. I think all of the Apollo astronauts, at some degree or other, had this problem.
The public stopped caring. This chapter is uncomfortable, but it is true. After the extraordinary, world-stopping, mind-bending miracle of Apollo 11, the American public largely stopped paying attention. Apollo 12 launched in November 1969, just 4 months after the first moon landing. The astronauts, Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon, did remarkable work. They landed precisely on target, deployed scientific instruments, and brought back important samples. Almost nobody watched. A congressman at the time reportedly said that his constituents were more worried about potholes on their streets than craters on the moon. That might sound harsh, but it reflected a genuine shift in public priorities. The Vietnam War was a daily source of national anguish. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had both been assassinated in 1968. American cities were burning. The Apollo program felt to a lot of people like an expensive distraction from very real, very urgent problems at home. By the time of Apollo 14 and beyond, television networks were cutting away from moon landing coverage to return to their regular programming. The ratings simply were not there. And in a democracy, sustained public enthusiasm is what keeps a program funded. Once the wow factor of the first landing wore off, Congress had very little political incentive to keep pouring billions of dollars into what felt to ordinary voters like a repetitive, expensive science experiment happening 250,000 miles away. The moon had become routine, and routine things lose their funding.
There's still so much more to explore. And that's one of the reasons why, after 5 decades, NASA is finally planning to send humans back to the moon.
The lost technology. You have probably heard the claim that we lost the technology to go back to the moon. This is technically a slight oversimplification, but it points to something real and genuinely staggering. What we actually lost was not the blueprints. The designs for the Saturn V rocket still exist. What we lost was the industrial infrastructure, the specialized factories, the trained workforce, and above all, the institutional knowledge of thousands of engineers and technicians who built and flew those missions. The Saturn V was the most powerful rocket ever flown successfully. It produced 7.6 million pounds of thrust and could lift hub-dread and 30 metric tons to low Earth orbit. After the Apollo program ended, the factories that made Saturn V components were dismantled or repurposed. The engineers who built the rockets retired. Their hands-on knowledge, the kind of knowledge that cannot fully be written down in a manual, walked out the door with them. When NASA wanted to restart something like it decades later, they essentially had to start from scratch with a new generation of engineers learning it all over again. It is worth noting that even at the height of the Apollo program, the level of risk astronauts were accepting would almost certainly never be approved today. As one expert put it, the Apollo missions were incredibly dangerous by any modern standard. Today's safety requirements are far more stringent, and designing a system that meets those requirements while also being capable of landing humans on the moon is a genuinely different and harder engineering challenge than what was done in the 1960s.
And you were at the height of it. Now we kind of take it for granted, huh?
Well, we take it for granted, but, it's no longer a space race.
Gene Cernan's heartbreak, Gene Cernan never got over it. And in the years after Apollo 17, he said so openly, repeatedly, and with a quiet kind of grief that is hard to listen to without feeling something. In a 2007 interview for NASA Oral Histories, Cernan said, We did it way too early considering what we're doing now in space. It's almost as if JFK reached out into the 21st century where we are today, grabbed hold of a decade of time, slipped it neatly into the 60s and 70s, and called it Apollo. After Apollo 17, Cernan said America stopped looking towards the next horizon. The United States had become a spacefaring nation but threw it away. We have sacrificed space exploration for space exploitation, which is interesting but scarcely visionary. And he was open about what that meant to him personally. He wrote in his memoir, The Last Man on the Moon, that he was no longer the luxury of being ordinary, enriched by an experience larger than life but also burdened by a paradox. Having visited another world and then having to return to this one, watching decade after decade pass with nobody following in his footsteps. Cernan said he hoped history would record what Apollo achieved. He believed it would take 50 or 100 years for people to truly understand the meaning of the Apollo program. He was also deeply vocal until the end of his life that the people who came after him had a responsibility. A statement from his family after his death said he was passionate about sharing his desire to see the continued human exploration of space, and encouraged our nation's leaders and young people to not let him remain the last man to walk on the moon. He died in January 2017. 8 years later, he is still the last person to have walked on the surface of another world.
And that orange band is about 1 meter wide, I think. About 1 meter. You can't get to the end of it, bottom of it, though, can you? I haven't been able to yet. Okay. Just to be sure, why don't we sample this side of it, too?
What the moon did to the men who went there. Going to the moon changed people, sometimes in beautiful ways, sometimes in devastating ones. And this is a part of the story that often gets left out. Edgar Mitchell, lunar module pilot on Apollo 14, had a profound spiritual experience on his way back from the moon. He described a sudden, overwhelming sense of universal connectedness. He said you develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. Mitchell spent the rest of his life pursuing questions about consciousness and the nature of human existence. James Irwin of Apollo 15 returned deeply affected and established a Christian ministry. Alan Bean of Apollo 12 became a full-time painter, dedicating his life to capturing what the lunar surface looked and felt like. He actually mixed real moon dust from the soil on his boot into some of his paintings. Alan Shepard reportedly wept looking back at the Earth from the moon's surface. And then there was Buzz Aldrin, whose story is one of the most sobering in the entire history of the space program. Within months of returning from Apollo 11 as one of the most celebrated humans on the planet, Aldrin fell into a severe depression. He later wrote that he had no goal, no sense of calling, no project worth pouring himself into. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of human achievement at the age of 39, and there was simply nothing left that could match it. He turned to alcohol, his marriage collapsed, and he spiraled into what he later called a good old-fashioned American nervous breakdown. It took him years to find his footing again. Aldrin himself wrote about his struggle. More and more, I turned to alcohol to ease my mind and see me through the rough times. His mother had died by suicide just weeks before the Apollo 11 mission. His grandfather had also died by suicide. He carried those fears alongside his depression. The man who stood on the moon was quietly falling apart, and the public had almost no idea. Even the commanders, who seemed to return more settled, were affected in ways that were hard to explain. Neil Armstrong became deeply private and reclusive after Apollo 11, rarely giving interviews and turning down almost all public attention. Walking on the moon had in some ways made ordinary earthly life feel impossible to explain to anyone who had not been there. The Space Shuttle. After Apollo ended, NASA didn't stop, but its focus shifted much closer to Earth. The Space Shuttle program, beginning in 1981, was designed to make space travel routine and more affordable through reusable spacecraft. It became a groundbreaking system, launching satellites, supporting scientific missions, and helping build the International Space Station. Over 135 missions were successfully flown, marking a new era of cooperation and technological progress. However, the shuttle never ventured beyond low Earth orbit. Despite its achievements, it remained a complex and risky machine, with the Challenger disaster in 1986 and the Columbia disaster in 2003 each taking 7 lives. For 3 decades, human spaceflight stayed confined near Earth, and the bold vision of reaching deeper into space faded. Gene Cernan openly lamented this. "Today, we are on a path of decay," he said at one point. "We are seeing the book close on 5 decades of accomplishment as the leader in human space exploration." The political merry-go-round of American presidential politics have repeatedly disrupted NASA's long-term plans. With each new administration, priorities shifted, programs were announced with ambition, funded briefly, and then scaled back or canceled by the next leadership. This stop-and-start pattern made it nearly impossible to maintain momentum for something as complex and long-term as returning to the moon. In 1989, George H.W. Bush introduced the Space Exploration Initiative, aiming for the moon and Mars, but it collapsed under high costs and weak support. In 2004, George W. Bush launched the vision for space exploration, leading to the Constellation program, only for Barack Obama to cancel it in 2010 due to delays and budget issues. Years of work were set aside. It wasn't until 2017, under Donald Trump, that the Artemis program revived the goal of returning to the moon, blending older designs with new commercial partnerships, though its original 2024 target has since slipped. Why space is genuinely brutally hard. Space travel sounds inspiring, but the reality is far harsher. Reaching the moon is not just difficult, it's one of the most complex things humanity has ever attempted. It requires countless systems working in perfect sync, from rockets and navigation to life support and communication. During the Apollo era, more than 400,000 people contributed to making those missions possible, and even then the margin for error was almost non-existent. The risks were terrifyingly real. On Apollo 17, Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt had just over 7 minutes to ignite their ascent engine and leave the moon. If that single engine failed, there was no backup and no rescue, only death on the lunar surface. Today's safety standards would never allow such risks, which is why modern missions are actually harder. It's no longer just about reaching the moon, but doing it safely and sustainably. The question people ask in whispers. Whenever the moon landings are discussed, a quiet question always follows. Did we really go? Let's be clear. The answer is yes. The landings were real, backed by overwhelming evidence. Lunar samples have been studied for decades, reflectors left on the moon still bounce lasers from Earth, and even the Soviet Union independently confirmed the missions at the time. But the persistence of doubt says something interesting about human nature. When people struggle to understand why such an incredible achievement was suddenly abandoned, they look for hidden explanations. Conspiracy theories fill that gap. In reality, the truth is far less dramatic. Decisions shaped by politics, funding cuts, shifting priorities, and fear. Not secrets or aliens, just human limitations. The China factor and the new space race. In 2026, a new space race is quietly gaining momentum, this time between the United States and China. Unlike the Cold War era, this competition is moving quickly and with clear intent. China has made rapid progress, testing new rockets and lunar landers while openly stating its goal to send astronauts to the moon by the late 2020s. If China reaches the moon first, it could shift global power in a major way and reignite urgency in the United States. NASA has already hinted at this, acknowledging that competition can be a powerful motivator. At the same time, this new race includes players who didn't exist before. Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin are reshaping space travel, bringing speed and ambition, but also new challenges to an already complex mission. Artemis, the return is coming, but when? NASA's Artemis program is humanity's best chance at returning to the moon since Apollo, and it's already made progress. Artemis 1 successfully orbited the moon in 2022, and Artemis 2 is expected to send astronauts around it, marking the first human journey to lunar space in decades. This mission represents a major step forward, even though it won't land on the surface. The first actual landing is now planned for Artemis 4 in 2028, targeting the moon's south pole, where water ice may exist. This time, the goal is not just to visit, but to stay. Building a long-term presence is a step toward Mars. However, delays, budget overruns, and technical challenges, especially with systems like SpaceX's Starship, keep pushing timelines further out. The return is coming, but like before, ambition continues to collide with reality. We went to the moon to win a race. When it ended, funding faded, interest declined, and missions stopped. The astronauts' return changed, some inspired, some broken. In 1972, a promise to return was made, but never kept. Now, in 2026, for the first time in decades, that promise feels close to reality. Do you think we will actually land on the moon again before 2030, or will something delay it again? Let us know in the comments.